Hello, my name is Wang. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History and a graduate research associate for the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies here at the Ohio State University. I'm here with Nick Booker, a PhD candidate in musicology and ethnomusicology and graduate research associate for the Center for Folklore Studies and the Humanities Institute, as well as Ted Nagasawa, an undergraduate student in medieval and Renaissance studies. We are joined today by Professor Stephen Mitchell, who holds a joint appointment at Harvard in Scandinavian and in folklore and mythology. Dr. Mitchell has written extensively on Nordic culture and literature, including the folklore of the late medieval and early modern periods, Icelandic sagas, Scandinavian ballads, witchcraft, magic, memory studies, performance, and so much more. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure's mine.
So for those who are listening who are unfamiliar with your work, would you tell us a little bit about your recent book, Old Norse Folklore, Magic, Witchcraft, and Charms in Medieval Scandinavia?
So it's a bit of a retrospective. There are a number of articles that in some ways were the foundation that led to the 2011 book that's called Witchcraft and Magic in the Nordic Middle Ages. So these were the Stichproben, these are the attempts to sort of get at what was going on with very specific sort of studies, which led into this more general kind of statement about the nature of witchcraft and magic mostly in the later Middle Ages, I suppose you could say, but also looking back somewhat at the earlier period, not as early as the late Iron Age, but with the beginning really with Christianity. It was this kind of missing in Old Norse studies. There had been a lot of attention paid over the years, very good and intelligent attention, both by literary and religious scholars, but also by archaeologists, at the nature of those topics in the Viking Age. And then beginning with especially a group of historians, let's say maybe 30 or 40 years ago, very, very fine, detailed, often statistically based analyses of what was happening in the Renaissance and later years, a lot of highly localized studies, other very fine sort of aspects. But there was this huge gap. It was really a sense, I think, in the field that not much had happened. Basically, with Christianity, all the old pagan stuff dies away, and we don't really know much about what's going on until about the time of the Reformation, and then we begin to get different kinds of records. So it was really an attempt, and the essays in that volume are directed toward digging out what we could from a variety of sources. So everything from runic inscriptions and wall paintings and judicial records and the provincial laws and so on from the Middle Ages. So that's the contents basically is on that. There is I also put in with some pains to provided an overview of the historiography of the field for non-Scandinavian readers, so they get a sense for what kind of work had been done. Because I think there was really some early 20th century work by Scandinavians that has never been translated that was worth knowing about. So I tried to also give it some airtime.
Fascinating. Yeah, sounds fascinating.
Can I ask, what got you interested in Norse culture and medieval Scandinavia? Did you know early on that those were topics you wanted to study in your academic career, or was it something you were drawn to later?
In serendipity, complete. It was the great thing the great universities can do for you is that I took a class that I didn't expect to take, and it was taught by a wonderful scholar, Lars Lurnot, with whom I then began working more in subsequent quarters, as it was back then at Cal. And quite honestly, he denies that this happened, but I remember very distinctly he said, "Steve, you're not going to get anywhere unless you know one of the Scandinavian languages. By the way, my wife's teaching Swedish this summer." So I started taking the languages, and that drew me into going abroad and studying and so on. And up until that time, I think about the only thing I knew about Scandinavia. There were these my parents were very avid antique hunters or junk-teak hunters, and so when I was a kid, we were often in these kind of barns filled with, implements, farm implements, and one thing or another. And they always had some corner that had like random books. And so as a kid, I began to collect these what used to be called boys' books. They were these usually late 19th century, early 20th century books that were, instructive, morally instructive, strive and succeed, the Boynton pluck, titles like that. And amongst them, I realized there was something I really, really cottoned on to. It was a kind of servant of the empire. It was a British writer named George Alfred Henty, Henty. And his trick was that he as far as I can make out, every single volume was dedicated to some historical moment when it would be interesting if there had been young British lads. And the British lads were always there with their father, who was a businessman or something of that sort. And because they happened to have grown up there, they spoke the local language and they spoke English. And that was always the thing, the secret sauce that allowed them to succeed. So it didn't matter if it was, medieval Venice or the Boer War. Or he would place them wherever. And the only reason I bring that up is when you asked me what did I know about Scandinavia before that, one of them was the 30 Years' War. And so he had something called, what was that one called? Well, it was with Gustavus Adolphus. Oh, Lion of the North. That was the title of Lion of the North. It was Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War. The sum total of my knowledge of Scandinavia before going off to college. I'm sorry to say, sort of funny given the fact that my entire life's been built on that at this point. Yeah.
What would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about medieval Scandinavia?
Part of it certainly is the thing that most people know most about, which they think immediately of Vikings, right? And the Vikings, first of all, even within the so-called Viking Age, that period from, say, 750 to 1050 or 1100, if you prefer, there certainly were Vikings, but not everybody was a Viking. There were plenty of people who never left their farm or hometown. I mean, they were working at home, smithing, farming, doing all the things that people do, raising families. But for those percentage who do go away, again, not all of them are necessarily engaged in what we think of as these barbaric Viking raids where there's, raping and murder and stuff going on. My dear friend Neil Price, with whom I taught for years in this Viking Studies program, has a beautiful analogy that I think works quite well. If you think about the pirates of the Spanish Main in the 17th century, they weren't always about plunder and destroying things. They're very much about getting the loot, right? And if you could go to the next town and trade, then you would trade if you could get a good deal. If you didn't think you were getting a good deal, you might pull out a pistol or a sword. So sometimes people describe Vikings as being well-armed businessmen, trying to make the best deals that they could. And I don't know if that works perfectly. I think there were probably different periods, and obviously there's the national, the great heathen army probably has conquest as much in mind when they're roaming around in England as they do other kinds of things. So there are obviously differences amongst the Vikings themselves, but probably that image, the Viking, which beginning at least with some of the big international convocations where countries are on display. Think of the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, with that sort of putting your country on display, and there have been earlier ones as well. That begins, I think, this process where countries began to market themselves, and I think it was the one in 1930 or so, Sweden, which had largely been left out a little bit because we mainly think of it as being a kind of Norwegian and Danish affair, especially since they were oriented toward the British Isles. And most of our sources, those early sources of the 19th century, are going to be primarily in English, from English sources. The Swedes felt a little bit left out, I think. In the 1930s, they promoted it as Sweden, land of the Vikings, and that became kind of a theme. You'll see it even today if you buy T-shirts in Sweden, they'll often say something like that. They too were Vikings, but as they would like have you believe very often, speaking for the entire country, I realize, but as they would have you think of them as being traders, not raiders, that they were the ones who were going to around the Baltic and down the river system, the Russian river system to Constantinople, trading all the way. yes, they probably were doing more of that than perhaps they were doing in the West, but they were also doing their fair share of raiding as well. So but it was always this kind of delicate balance. And I'm sure it must have depended entirely on what kind of reception they got and what the possibilities were. So I think that's the biggest misconception. And then I'd say the other thing that I see quite often is that the assumption that because certain things were happening on the continent, they would have happened there. So you'll sometimes see, I think, entirely erroneous references to feudalism in Scandinavian. As far as I know, Sweden at least certainly never had any form of feudalism. I don't think anywhere should be a little bit cautious about this, because what is Denmark in that period where it extends fairly far south, toward, not as far as, but down toward Hamburg, right? I'm not sure what's happening in some of the duchies down there, but certainly the Scandinavia itself doesn't have feudalism, which people tend to think anywhere in the Christian West would have had in that period. So I think that's, again, something that's slightly confusing sometimes.
What were concepts of magic in medieval Scandinavia like?
It's a great question, but a tough one. It doesn't have any easy answers. I think if we kind of work our way chronologically backwards, starting with the Middle Ages more, I think there you see sometimes you'll see quite a few references, in fact, to the old gods. And indeed, even up into the modern period, there are charms that are collected in various parts of Scandinavia where they name some of the old gods. But I don't know that they're necessarily thinking of them as being the old gods. They may just be names that sound like devil names, or who knows what they are. But they do get incorporated. And as recently as into the 19th century, you have folklorists who collect material where they're naming Frigg and Freya and Odin and Thor and various charms. Now, I personally have made the argument often, and that's a large part what that second volume is about, that Odin in particular seems to live on, and there are some attributes. I should be cautious. The name Odin and certain of the attributes of the old Odin seem to live on. As we know that amongst other things that are said about him in some of our earliest sources, is that Odin is a great one for protecting wealth, and if you lose things, he's keen on wealth in a variety of ways, and that tradition continues right on into the 19th century, in fact. So I think there might be an argument to be made that that's a fairly specific legacy of the old pagan traditions. I think otherwise there can be just names, and it depends a lot also on what particular geographic region you're talking about. I think in Iceland the situation is different because of the nature of Icelandic literary tradition, oral literary tradition, the use of rímur and other traditional poetic practices. I think some of these materials are much more vibrant there amongst a much larger swathe of the populace than they are elsewhere in Scandinavia. And so in Iceland, you'll see, even in the 16th century, charms that are very specific with certain kinds of figures from the past being named, perhaps a little bit less so elsewhere. But then if we try to go back into the pagan period, I think it's very, very difficult to know these kind of questions of mentality and how it was meant to work. And there, I think archaeologists, I mentioned Neil Price earlier, he and Leszek Gadela have done a lot of work on magic staffs and some of the kind of material objects that are found in the graves of sorceresses, for example. And it suggests a world where amulets, maybe magic potions, certain kinds of magic objects, and things that are imbued with power in the minds of the people play an outsized kind of role. So I would guess, without knowing for sure, that these are things that might have comparable situations elsewhere around the world in different cultures. Neil has often has pointed toward the possibility that things are being borrowed from the Sami, the so-called Lapps, for example. There are kind of exchanges going on, cultural as well as economic exchanges that may be playing a role in those, and it seems to make a great deal of sense to me.
Well, not to ruin the surprise, but could you tell us a little bit about what you'll be speaking about in the Utley lecture later today?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, this is I guess pretty well trodden ground in a way. There is a runic inscription that there's been I guess now 75-year debate about exactly what the meaning of the last line is. It's metrical. It seems to be poetry, and it says that the woman who's erected this runestone, her husband, will be remembered. And then the question is it to be understood as in an elegy, in some kind of a sorrow song, I guess you could say, or is it with weeping, with tears? And the question is this, or do we to understand that there might have been an East Norse tradition of so-called grautur, of elegy? And some people have picked up this idea and run with it pretty heavily. So in some of those kind of early women's literary histories that were being produced in the decades ago, it's said as a fact, yes, it was a kind of elegy that only women sang, and it had a very definite sort of status. Other people have looked at it, don't think that that's quite so likely, but it's still an open question, and the suggestion is that perhaps there should be more research done on it. So what I'm trying to do is work on that. Now that entails a lot of different things. It has to do with certain kinds of, it's a moment in the early 11th century, right around 1040, something like that. It's a moment when pagan Viking Age Sweden is transitioning into Christian medieval Sweden. We're still a couple of decades away from the founding of the first bishopric in Sweden in 1060, but what we can see is that there are clearly changes going on. The runestones are now, have for a while, but especially now, you see overwhelming use of, for example, crucifixes, crosses on them. They're clearly Christian. There are other signs about the ways in which things are changing. And there's also a growing kind of entrepreneurial class that's emerging. And so what you're getting is a kind of big farmer, I guess, a storbonde, maybe you could say. It's a class that's not a lower class kind of peasant farmer, but it's also not aristocracy or nobility. It's kind of well-to-do, and they seem to be people who have often, and it probably has to do with the inclination toward trade. They seem very, very often to have been in what they would call Greece, that is the Byzantine Empire. They've been in the East, in the Slavic world. They've been to the British Isles. They've been to Jutland in Germany. They seem to be traders who've amassed a fair amount of wealth. And out of that kind of class are going to be chosen in the subsequent centuries the so-called lawmen. So the lawmen play a role in all of this. And the lawmen aren't, I know when we think of lawmen, we think of Westerns and a certain kind of, Marshal Will Kane in High Noon or something. It's not like that. They're actually the chief legal expert, I would say. So they're if anything, perhaps a bit more like the legendary, Judge Roy Bean. They're sort of manipulators and, to some extent, crafty users of the law. But it's something that emerges, and in the context of this kind of lawman tradition, there are these important assembly sites where they will hold court, kind of literally. The assembly sites probably had all kinds of different uses. They were sometimes used for cultic activities, maybe connected even with the opening of these court sessions. They might have been used quite possibly for levying troops, for example. But so it was a kind of town hall, an open-air town hall, but very definitely used for proclamations, we think, as we reconstruct from later textual sources, where you could bring court cases and have them heard and pass laws and that sort of thing. And then later on, the lawmen are going to begin codifying those. So by the time you get to the late 13th century, we have written laws from a lot of the so-called landskapslagar, the provincial laws. That plays a big role in all of this as well, and trying to figure out how we interpret this runic inscription, because as it happens, it's actually built. It's one of two runestones, and it's dedicated to the erection of a new assembly site. And I think part of what this assembly site is about is it's not the old one. The old one would have been associated with the pagan traditions. This one's pretty clearly going to be Christian in orientation, and I think that's part of its story. It's a fairly complicated story, but I'm trying to really answer this question of elegy, I guess, and all of this feeds into it in various ways. So the other thing you need to know about, I guess, the other thing I will talk about is this tradition, which we know existed in Old Icelandic, called erfikæði, erfijjóð. So it's this question of inheritance, or it is elegy, but it also has to do with inheritance in a way. And that'll play a role in it as well. So you'll have to come and hear the entire spiel. But the other thing that's the important element in it, I guess, is that I don't think it's ever been connected. The discussions have always been about this one particular runic inscription. What I want to add to that discussion is this question of what also happens right around 1040, which is that about 30 ships, we think, from one source, are led by somebody named Ingvar, and they go off into the east. They're probably going down as far as modern-day Georgia. Right? He supposedly, there's some connections with the Georgian Chronicles, where this Ingvar dies in a battle there at about 1041. And both it and the Nordic sources seem to agree on this 1041 date, which is why I'm so specific. Usually, based on language and art styles and so on, you wouldn't be that specific, but we have reasons for thinking 1040 is about the right date. And so you get quite a few, maybe as many as 24 to 30 runic inscriptions that memorialize the deaths of all these people who took off and mostly died. Some of them came back to tell the tale, but mostly end up dying off in the east. And of those, there are about 14 that are metrical. And what I'm trying to say is, are they also in the same kind of character that they might be this elegy type? So I hope that completes the story. It's kind of a pretty hackneyed, sloppy way of doing it, but that's the kind of kit that I'm working with and trying to see if we can sift it in a way that we can come up with an answer. To be quite candid with you, I don't have an answer yet. I'm still playing with it and thinking, well, it seems possible, but I don't know if I can prove it yet. So that's where that is, I guess.
I'm Wang. I have been here with my fellow Ohio State University students, Nick Booker and Ted Nagasawa, interviewing Dr. Stephen Mitchell about his work in Nordic culture and medieval Scandinavia. Dr. Mitchell, I'm really looking forward to your Francis Lee Utley lecture later today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you all for your wonderful questions.